Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to this Blavatnik What's in the News session. I'm Bill Emmott. I have with me, and I'm a fellow in practice, a visiting fellow in practice here at the school, and I'm running these sessions several times a term whenever I can. I have for today what we're calling the forgotten crisis, but we're making sure that it's not forgotten. Indeed, it's just come back into the news very much the last couple of days. Yemen, the war in Yemen, the conflict in Yemen and the humanitarian crisis in Yemen that has been going on for several years, but has, as we will discuss, been somewhat overshadowed in at least the external perspective by events in Syria and elsewhere. But nevertheless, fatalities, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, fatalities over the past 2 years exceed 10,000 people, with some 40,000 wounded. Some 18.8 million people require humanitarian and protection assistance, and 2 million are internally displaced. So on any criterion, this is a very serious situation. It's got new attention in the United States, largely thanks to Donald Trump, including Yemen as one of his 7 countries for his travel ban, and by the American-led raid on January the 29th, I think I'm right in saying, in which a Navy SEAL was killed, but also, and that's what caught American attention, but of course a lot of civilians were killed, which was a very more serious part of it. For our discussion, I have 2 Yemeni panelists here. I'm delighted, and many people representing or from other countries in the region, I think, here in the audience will make their point of view heard, I'm sure. I have Safa Karman, Masters in Public Policy student here, and former, one has to say, but anyway, a journalist, former journalist.
Still with Al Jazeera.
Oh, you're technically still a journalist with Al Jazeera, who she worked for since 2010. And on my right, Rafat Ali Al-Akhali, a former, technically not still a minister in the Yemeni government, which he was from November 2014 to September 2015. Prior to that, very active in the reform program in Yemen, and now here as a fellow in practice here at the school. I'm going to start, as always, with up to 5-minute opening statements from my 2 panelists, and then we'll lead a discussion involving all of you. Safa, we're starting with you.
I was telling him, please don't apply this time the policy of ladies first. He said journalists first. I said he's an ex-minister, so you can start with him. So, I'm so happy that this session discusses Yemen, because Yemen is... So whenever they remember Yemen, they say the forgotten war or the forgotten crisis. But the question I always ask, is it forgotten or neglected? Because to forget something, usually you don't have the choice to do that. But when you choose not to pay attention to a situation or to a person, then you neglect it. And when you neglect that person or that situation, you become responsible for the consequences of forgetting it. So for me, Yemen is a neglected crisis, not a forgotten crisis. And the reasons for that are, what I see are 3 reasons, main reasons. And the first, most talked about reason is the geopolitics of the country. So if you look at the map, you would see that Yemen is kind of sandwiched between Saudi Arabia and the sea. Although Oman is kind of to the right, but they don't actually intervene that much. So whenever there is a crisis, like now the war, you don't hear about any refugee crisis in Yemen as you hear in Syria, because people don't have a way to run. So Saudi Arabia kind of blocked the way, and they will go to the sea, and they don't want to go to Somalia, because in Somalia the situation is worse. So the geopolitics of the country does not bring that much of attention to it. And the influence of Saudi Arabia, and because it's the biggest exporter of oil, then the West kind of don't want to upset it by intervening in Yemen. So that's the most talked about reason. The second reason is the international community and the media usually looks at Yemen from the lens of terrorism, which is Al-Qaeda, and they keep focusing on that, forgetting all other problems. So suddenly nowadays, you see the media, they wake up discovering that there is a famine in Yemen, while people, economists have been like warning the world that look at the economy in Yemen. For the last 15 years, pay attention to the economy, not to the extremists or to Al-Qaeda. And now suddenly there is famine. Why? Because it didn't pay attention to that kind of crisis. And now this applied when Trump came also. The only thing he talks about Yemen is like among the Muslim banned countries, and then the first military action he exercised as a president was a raid against Yemen. And now what pains me the most is the misinformation. It's either misinformation or lack of information about Yemen. And as a journalist, I blame myself sometimes first because I left journalism when I came here. But Yemen is not being covered in the media the way it's supposed to be. So the crisis in Yemen is no less like graphic and catastrophic than Syria, maybe more. So for example, last year there was this UN report saying that what took Syria 5 years, like the humanitarian crisis in Syria, took it 5 years to reach this level. It took Yemen 5 months. And all the attention is on Syria, not in Yemen, again based on the geopolitics and the terrorism lens. And when you also look at the news, when they remember to talk about Yemen, then the story, how it's being told in a very, I don't want to say biased, because some journalists are not biased, but they are ignorant, they don't care about the country, I don't know what's wrong. So for example, let me give you the example of timing. So go and Google The Guardian, New York Times, Al Jazeera, any documentaries. Even Al Jazeera, sometimes the Westerner journalists, when they cover, they really also fall into this trap. So they tell you the war started in March 2015, which is the date Saudi Arabia intervened in the country. But the war did not start in that day. It started when the capital, Sana'a, fell in the hands of the militia. And Saudi Arabia intervened because of that date. And that is one example. The same thing happened with the Arab Spring. So when these peaceful demonstrations were sweeping the Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, all the focus went on Egypt, in Syria, and nobody talked about Yemen, although Yemen was a very beautiful, special revolution, because Yemen is the second country after the US with the armed position per capita. We are the second. Like tribes, they have trunks, they have bombs. The only thing they lack is the jets and the drones. That's it. And if they have the money, they would buy them. And the state wouldn't actually prevent them from doing that. But our revolution was peaceful. So Yemen was the real country that witnessed a cultural and social change happening more than other countries, because you see people with a literacy rate that could be up to 60%. They don't even know how to read the capitals, the alphabets. And they suddenly put their arms back inside their homes, and they went to the streets chanting, peaceful, peaceful. And they would tell you that we want the state to protect us, and if the state protects us, we will give them the arms. We want a state, we want justice. But what happened is the international media did not tell that story, and they would tell you, they would broadcast the segment of the ousted president threatening the world, if I go from power, then Al-Qaeda will take over Yemen. Okay, so why didn't you just take your camera and take it off from the ousted president, go to the streets and film the demonstrators, the people who are asking for a better Yemen? But that did not happen. So Yemen is either misreported or not reported, and I blame the Western media, the journalists who care about telling the truth. You see people, journalists are willing to go to Syria and die because they want to tell the truth, but they don't care about Yemen as much. They care about Syria or Somalia or Rwanda. So, yeah. That's
okay, thank you very much. It's particularly good to be reminded about the peaceful revolution, actually, in Yemen that was an early part of the hopeful period of the so-called Arab Spring. And was often cited at the time as being part of the sense of hope. Now, Rafat, where does it go from here? how does peace arrive?
I think one of the journalists commented that maybe a reason for not having enough coverage on Yemen is that there is no easy narrative. There is no very clear good and evil that you can just pin and explain what is happening. So I'm going to try and, in 5 minutes, have an easy narrative that explains where we are going with the peace process, why is it taking this long to reach anywhere, and what's happening on the ground as well. And so currently we have an ongoing, what is called a comprehensive peace process led by the UN. And unfortunately, I at least don't think that it's comprehensive for the reasons I'll mention. But what we have seen over the past almost 2 years since the big war started, let's call it the big war, which is when the Saudi intervention began, and almost 2.5 years since the capital fell in the hands of the rebels. What we are seeing is a complete fragmentation and disintegration of the country, of the different regions of the country. And militia groups taking arms and fighting under different flags, whether it's resistance militias or different names, but ultimately taking control of the areas they have and not having any link to the national level government or to the central elites that used to run the country. And yet the UN peace process is still bringing together these national level actors who no longer control on the ground in the different regions. So we have the eastern region of Hadramaut. In the center we have Marib. In the south we have Aden and Lahj and Abyan. And in Taiz, we have different areas of Taiz controlled by different militias. All these local actors are now the decision makers on the ground. Yet they are not part of the official peace process, because that artificial peace process is still happening between the legitimate government, which is now outside the country, but now goes back to Aden, and between the Houthi / Saleh, ex-President Saleh rebel movement. And so we have this artificial ongoing process, but things on the ground are disintegrating, and on the ground different militias are controlling it. At the same time, the artificial process that's bringing together the two sides is not taking into consideration the regional actors. So we have the coalition, which is mostly led by Saudi Arabia and UAE, and they are the ones that are the decision makers of the war itself. And yet they are, in a way, hiding behind the legitimate, quote-unquote, government and saying the negotiations are between these two and we're just there to kind of support the government. But in reality, that's not how it's working. And so the third point why this is not comprehensive, so first point, the local actors are not there. Second point, the regional actors are not there. The third point is that it's not really taken into consideration what has happened over the past 2 years. So it's still based on the assumption that the National Dialogue Conference outcomes, which happened in 2014, are still valid. The main outcome of the National Dialogue was changing Yemen into a federal state and having 6 regions in the country and coming up with a formula for power sharing and revenue sharing, more importantly. Clearly, that is no longer accepted by the rebels, because that was the whole reason why they came out and took control of the capital. And yet there is an assumption that everyone is still accepting those outcomes, and it's not part of the negotiations that's happening. So everyone is negotiating, but in their mind, they want to look ahead and figure out, where do I fit in the future Yemen? And that's not currently on the table. While this dysfunctional peace process is happening, things on the ground are deteriorating on the humanitarian aspect. We are having today officially the worst humanitarian crisis in the world in Yemen, with over 80% of the population in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, malnutrition rates going almost close to the level of what could be termed a famine. And yet there is so much politics around using the F word, and which is why nobody has labeled what's happening in Yemen as a famine so far. Now the UN, in its latest report, is saying, warning of famine in 2017, but we already know that in many areas of the country that is already a reality. What's even worse is that, especially for the young people of Yemen, increasingly they are running out of hope. For many months now, for almost 2 years, they have got no source of income, nothing to be able to sustain them and look forward to. And so in one of the interviews, a young person from Taiz said, when asked about the future, he said, "What future? There is no future. There is no hope." And that was actually on the BBC. And I think that is the most dangerous level that we can get to. Because as young people feel that there is no hope and there is no future, they are faced with only two alternatives, waiting for death to come and get them in their houses, or go to meet death elsewhere. And we've seen tens of thousands of young people picking up arms and going to fight for the different sides because they'd rather go and meet death elsewhere. And so I think it's a responsibility for all of us, global citizens as well, to try and do something to resolve this before it becomes too late to remember. And that's what we've been trying to advocate for. If the world does not remember soon enough, it will be difficult to stop what will happen.
Now, thank you very much. Now, looking at this question of what narrative to look at, which also leads us towards what path towards the resolution happens. I mean, I think purely as an observer of the way in which this has been thought about and talked about, say that we've had outside Yemen two main narratives. One is the terrorism narrative, and the other is the proxy war narrative. It's notable, I can't resist a jibe at our Foreign Secretary over the fact that when Boris Johnson accused the Saudis of fighting proxy wars, he'd failed to notice that Britain was also involved in that proxy war. So this is a proxy war that we are part of, since we are supporting the coalition of Saudi Arabia and UAE in this. But thirdly, there's the narrative that Rafat has outlined of regional disintegration, of the breakup of the country into regional militias and regional factions. Which of those narratives should we now focus on if we are to find a solution or to find something that provides hope for the young Yemenis that Rafat was talking about? Is the proxy war the dominant reality, Safa, or is regional disintegration now the dominant reality?
I think back to the point of narrative, for me, in order to find the solution, we need first to understand what the problem is. And the problem in Yemen is that people are looking for a solution without starting analyzing what the problem is. So any kind of solution you bring, it's like, like a doctor, you can't treat the heart by giving medicine for the kidney. So it doesn't work like that. So with Yemen, I think the most problematic thing is the narrative and the terminology we use to describe the situation. So starting from Rafat, when he says militias, and he says resistance militias, that is for me so problematic. You cannot call a resistance group a militia, even if they make mistakes, even if they commit some violations, they should be held accountable for these violations, but they're not a militia. These people took the arms from the first place to defend themselves, to protect their families, and to defend their land. And the violations they commit are reactions to the super violations are being committed by the Houthis. For example,
What is the difference between that and a militia?
The militia is you break the law. The Houthis are militias because they took their arms, they took control of the state, and the state collapsed into their hands.
Okay, so
the people in Taiz who are fighting the Houthis, they are resistance defending themselves. And we cannot put them in the same category of the Houthis and the forces of the ousted President Ali Abdullah Saleh. And for me, that is why, because of not using the right terms, the world does not pay the right attention to Yemen. Because they think The people are fighting themselves between them. Like the civil war, people did not choose to pick up the arms and fight each other. You have, you have people who are defending themselves against people who are offending them. So until you address the offender and you tell them that you should stop, until the UN step up and force the Houthis to put down their weapons, to hand their weapons to the state and to stop the war and to come back to the negotiations table, then the resistance will stop. And Rafat also talked about what the artificial political process. Why is it artificial? Why isn't the resistance group, not the resistance militia, why don't they go to the political table and negotiate as people are asking them? Because every time there is a ceasefire, the Houthis and the forces of the ousted President Ali Abdullah Saleh, they take it as a chance to regroup and to rearm. This has been systematic for the last 5 years. So how would you ask the resistance to come back to the negotiation table when the Houthis are rearming themselves, regrouping themselves, and fighting again?
What is the basis of the Houthis' ability to rearm? Let's just discuss that a moment, which brings us also into the proxy war. The role of Iran as suppliers of weapons or as an influence in this versus other bases on which the Houthis sustain themselves. We ought to talk about those, where the incentives faced by or surrounding the Houthis in reacting to this situation. Rafat, what is your analysis of their interests and their resources?
Yeah, I think just to clarify, I think from a definitional perspective, whether a militia is fighting for the just cause or a militia is an unorganized armed group that is not part of the state. So what they fight for could be up for a noble goal or no, they should, but they're still a militia, according to official definition of what.
Resistance.
Okay.
It's a huge difference.
Yeah, historically, it would be the word would be used on either way. Certainly, if you like, in kind of U.S. terminology,
and this is the problem.
An armed militia is a resistance group in American history.
I think then that is wrong, because for something to be historical, it doesn't make it right.
Yeah, well, we're just talking about language.
But I think the role that Iran is playing is an interesting piece to look at, because one of the first triggers that got Saudi and the Arab coalition to launch their intervention in Yemen was a sense and a feeling that Iran is becoming the #1 regional power. Overnight, the princes and kings of the Gulf woke up to the images of the Iranian foreign minister Zarif shaking hands with the P5+1 and being at the same level of the major powers as they signed the nuclear deal. And overnight, the Gulf felt that the Western attention is now turning into Iran as the new friend in the region, and Iran should not be allowed to get to that level. So that was kind of, I think, a shocking realization, combined with a new generation of leadership in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, younger people who are much more willing to go on interventionist agenda than their very much conservative previous generations. So that all combined, and unfortunately combined on Yemen, because the perception that Iran is now the major power and is playing its games through proxies in the region, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, has to be stopped. And so the message was going to be sent that Saudi Arabia and UAE and others will not stand silent as all this happens, and we will be firm in our response to it. That's one of the major reasons that launched the war or the intervention of the coalition in Yemen. Iran so far has had an overall negative, I would say, influence in Yemen. They have never been a key player in the country in the past. Even from a development assistance perspective, let's say Saudi Arabia, UAE, they are the biggest donors to Yemen. The Gulf countries are the biggest donors. Iran has never played and never been a part of the Yemeni scene for the past decades. And so the only role that they started playing is through very small investments in these rebel groups and different militias that they are getting loyalty. So the Houthis, for example, are very much inspired by the model of the Iranian revolution, and they don't make that a secret, and that was part of their propaganda, and they like the idea of having a spiritual leader and being connected to that. They've also received a lot of support from Iran in terms of media support. So the TV station that they own is based in Lebanon in the Hezbollah territories, supported by Hezbollah and other factions from Iran. But the point is, Iran is getting, as I mentioned earlier in our side discussion, the best return on investment in Yemen. So their investment in Yemen is very low, but they get all this perception of being the key player, of playing, of pulling all the strings, of taking all the decisions, which is not accurate. And so what is happening now is Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf coalition is paying a very high price to try and send the message that they are the more powerful and they are the ones in control in Yemen. Right now, after 2 years, it's only been a completely negative return on Saudi and others because of the violations to international humanitarian law that has now branded Saudi and the coalition as by the UN and by the different NGOs as big violators, but also financially drained a lot of their resources in this war. And it doesn't seem to have an end in sight. And so while all this is being invested on the Saudi side, all Iran has to do is make a couple statements, ship a few weapons shipments, and kind of just be there and say, you know, no, we're the ones here and we're the players.
How does it look? That's the final question, and I'll open up to the room. How does it look, Safa, from a Saudi point of view and from a point of view of the Gulf? I mean, this has been, since the intervention, a failure so far. And indeed, what one reads is that Saudi Arabia cannot even control its side of the border from Yemen, let alone have a decisive influence over the past 2 years in Yemen itself. What does that do to Saudi Arabia and its motivation and its thinking? Double up or sue for peace?
I think Saudi Arabia is really, kind of stuck in Yemen. And in addition to what Rafat said, Saudi Arabia, it was because of the transition of power, and also at the same time, not only that, the main reason was because the Houthis started performing military exercises by the border with Saudi Arabia. And after they swept all the way from the north to the capital Sana'a and then to the south, and then they reached the strategic city of Aden, which was like an international red line, Saudi Arabia intervened as a way of protecting their own national security and interests. So Saudi Arabia does not really care about Yemen that much. Actually, we are paying them for the mistakes Saudi Arabia has been committing since the 60s. So this is not like starting. And the main reason for the problem is in Yemen, from a revolutionary point of view, starting from the Arab Spring, is imposing the Gulf Initiative, which gave full immunity to the ousted President Ali Abdullah Saleh. And that was the problem, because the ousted president, as a way to retaliate against the revolution that kicked him out of power, he made an alliance with the Houthi militias, and they took over the capital, and the rest of is history. So Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen was to protect its security, its national security. So they really want to find a solution to get out of Yemen, because no one expected the war to last. Now it's going to enter the second year, right? So the expectations were like 2 months or 3 months. But Yemen is a mountainous country. And the Houthis have been through 6 wars since 2004. And it's really hard for any military to come, for any military forces to come and fight the Houthis. They're like really, really hard. And the Saudi army, it's the airstrike, so it's really hard to win any kind of battle in Yemen historically. So for me, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, the way they want to find the solution is through trying to broker political dialogue and negotiations, which until now all trials have failed so far. And because of this proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is, I'm not really sure about what Rafat said, because the journalist inside me, I don't have facts. I don't have numbers to say, yes, Iran is involved or Iran is not involved. But the activist and the politician within me says, yes, they are involved. And because 2 years ago, 2 ships full of military weapons, they were on their way to Yemen and they were blocked. And they came from Iran. They were coming for the Houthis, so they did not enter. And the most important thing that is blocking finding any solution is the Houthi ideology. Even if Iran does not support them, like say that if it does not support them with money, although I believe as an activist they do, but ideologically they follow the Khomeini. So you have this institution that drives them spiritually, and that is what makes the political process hard. These people do not speak the language of politics. They do not speak the language of peace. They do not speak the language of negotiations. They have this religious aspiration. They have this, what they believe, the divine entitlement to rule the people. And that is what they want. So every time, that is why it is hard for Saudi Arabia, the UN, whoever comes with whatever solution, it's hard to bring them to the table because you don't speak the language they speak. And that is why the kind of stuff.
Let's open up to contributions from the room. Who would like to begin? In the center here. We've got a microphone coming. If you just whisk the microphone round. Sorry. Having to...
Does the Shia versus Sunni dimension to this conflict make it impractical to put the country back together again ever in the future?
Can Yemen exist as a country, or does it need to return to pre-1991 division, but on your basis on a much more fragmented way?
Yeah.
What do you think, Rafat?
I think on one side the Shia Sunni is part of trying to come up with an easy narrative that, especially for the outside world to understand what is happening. But I think it's, again, one of the, definitely a factor, not Shia Sunni per se, but Zaydi sect that the Houthis follow. But it's a factor, but I think it's a factor being played up by both the fighting parties to mobilize people mostly, because it's the easiest thing to polarize fighters, to say, you are fighting a religious war against these other religions. But I would hesitate to say that it's the dominant dynamic that is driving this conflict. Rather, I think the dominant dynamic is more the power hunger and simple power fighting. Is it too late to imagine going back to the same Yemen that we knew? I think it will take a very long time if it will ever happen. But I think the most expected outcome is that we would have a much more decentralized form of governance that will definitely not look like what we had before. Whether that's a federal or some autonomous regions in the country or what, but it's not going to be along any lines that we knew before as well. Because even the 1990 lines along North and South Yemen that then became united in 1990 is no longer applicable, because the East, which was part of the South, doesn't want to be part of the South anymore, and the North is all fragmented as well.
So it all changed. Safa, you want anything to add to that, or you?
I think the Yemeni people by nature are not sectarian, but what is happening is the international rhetoric is actually fueling and pushing the Yemeni people to be sectarian. So one of them, people are being it's either because of the loss of hope Rafat talked about, is either they go to the extreme of going and joining these militia groups, not the resistance, the militia groups, like ISIS and the Houthis, or they really lose any kind of hope and they start, even refusing the religion, they reject Islam. And so you have either two extremes. And I'll give you an example of how the West is really pushing the Yemenis to go and join these terrorist groups. So in June 2015, Mosul fell in the hands of ISIS in Iraq. 3 months later, Sana'a, the capital, fell in the hands of the Houthi militias. And when you see how the international community reacted towards what happened in Iraq, because ISIS was the one that took control of Mosul, and how they reacted against the Houthis when they took control of Sana'a, it was a totally different thing. Although it's the same act, and this is the double standard, this is the hypocrisy of the international community. And that's what the individual, the basic Yemeni feel, is like, why is it when the Sunni militia takes control of a state, the whole international community goes crazy and they push them out? And when the same thing happens in Sana'a, when a militia armed group take control of a state, no one says a word. Actually, not a single embassy closed their doors in Sana'a or released a statement when the capital Sana'a fell. It took them some time. And it took them a very long time to condemn it. So people were like, really the West, they have a problem with us Sunnis. So we're going to go and join the Sunni extremist ISIS to defend us. And then Trump comes and he says, those countries, the Yemen and the 5 less countries which are majority Sunni countries, he comes and bans them. And then he comes to Yemen. So people is like, okay, you see us as terrorists, we're not, but then since you see us, then we are, because we have to defend ourselves. So this double standard, it's actually really fueling and pushing people to go and join extremism. But for me, I feel like the US and the West, they should not pay like billions of dollars to fight terrorism. They have to pay these billions to rehabilitate the people, to bring them back to who they really are. Like Yemeni people, we are the second country again in the world with arms, but we don't pick up our arms and fight because we want to fight, because someone pushed us to defend ourselves. Whether you want me to join the extremist group or at the end I want to fight to protect myself. So now it is, again, to answer your question, it is being sectarian. It's not, but it is being pushed to be sectarian.
But you're not saying that the West or the outside world, which is a better phrase in my view, the outside world should have been completely uninterested in the fall of Mosul to Islamic State.
No, absolutely not. They should be treated the same. The Houthi, actually,
but they were different. One was the capture of a region by
ISIS.
By ISIS. The other was an attempt to capture a country.
It was not an attempt. It happened.
It happened. Yes.
So Sana'a failed.
Yes.
So I usually say this. People ask me why. Why is the international community treating ISIS like this, and they don't treat the Houthi militias like that? Again, there's Sunni and Shia. And my own explanation, which is the only explanation that gives me the answer and I feel comfortable with, is the idea of jihad. Jihad is part of the Sunni ideology. So their the enemy is in the extremist version of Sunni. The enemy is the West. So what they want is to spread Islam and take over. So the West is always afraid of this thing called hijab, called jihad. So I have a very interesting story with hijab. So yeah. So I really had jihad. So the other thing, but I
mean, just to press on this, the outside world made a military intervention to try to throw the Houthis out of Sana'a.
No, so that was a Saudi decision. It was not.
Sorry, is not Saudi part of the outside world?
But
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are part of the outside world.
But not the Western. The US at the end.
So you distinguish between.
Absolutely.
So a Western intervention and a Saudi intervention are somehow in different categories.
Yes, the UN does not mind the Houthis take control of Sana'a. They don't mind any Shia group. I'm sorry, I really feel sorry that I am talking in a sectarian word, but I'm being forced. This is reality, these are facts, and I'm trying to be journalist. And
the U.S. support the Arab coalition.
no, let me finish the idea of
No,
jihad,
do they
because
support
it's really
the coalition or not?
They
Yes.
did, because they didn't have a choice. It's Saudi Arabia. They can't say no to her. So,
Okay,
so
well,
no,
we will
the
take
idea
some
of
more
jihad.
views
Can I
from
finish the idea of jihad? So the Shia group, they don't have jihad. Their enemy is us because they want to reach power. But for Sunnis, the enemy is the West, so they want to reach it. That's why they don't react against the Shia militias.
more views from the audience. We've got a microphone just behind you.
I'm a Fulbright fellow. I want to ask, there's some basis for Saudi concern for essentially Iranian intervention in regional affairs. We can name one, the 1979 mosque attack in Saudi Arabia was really conducted by proxies of Hezbollah. And sponsored by Iran. Number two, we had the case of Khobar Towers in 1980, which was an Iranian-sponsored attack on basically homeland security in Saudi Arabia. We also had the 2016 suicide bombing attacks against mosques that were really conducted by Iranian-sponsored terrorists. I think that we have to give Saudi Arabia some credit to try to defend their interests. And they view essentially, but not necessarily the AQI, which was really kind of forced out of Saudi Arabia and frankly pushed into Yemen. But they have their own, what I would argue, their own security concerns, and they look at fighting in Yemen as better than fighting on their own ground in Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Very interesting. Let me take a couple more contributions from the room before we come back to the panel. So next.
I just want to make a general comment that I think that after what I heard, I think that the fact that the West, the non-Arab world, is not very interested in Yemen, because I think today there are three forces in the Middle East. You have either Sunni, Shia, and you have ISIS. I think putting ISIS, even though they are Sunni, with the same group as Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi is misleading. It's not the balance of power. Now, I think that Yemen is ignored because it's just another place to some extent that Iran is messing around with the internal politics, like in Lebanon, like in Iraq, like in Syria, like in Gaza. And this is something that the world has seen for the last 30 years, all around the Middle East. So it's something that is easier for the world to just ignore to some extent. While in Syria, I think that in Syria the world wasn't very interested until ISIS came. And ISIS is like a wild horse that nobody controls. You don't have a state that is backing ISIS. Everybody's against ISIS. They do very good PR. So I think that to some extent, and of course it's not justifying, but it's a way to understand it, that the fact that what we see in Yemen, it's another theater of Iranian war, proxy war in the Middle East, and another theater for the war between the Sunni and Shia, is a way to understand why we don't hear in the news so much about Yemen.
Someone else from the room? Yes, lady here.
My question is just around this idea of narrative and meaning creation that I think Safa and Prof. Rafat was mentioning earlier, that this is the idea of whether you call something a militia or a resistance group, whether the dictionary has the same definition for different groups, like our general understanding of those meanings are very much different. So my question is, how do you reframe or create meanings around the conflict that's happening in Yemen to create a greater sense of global responsibility? Because we've seen around the world that when actually maybe the people in the countries in the West or around the world care, then they force those governments to be more accountable to their action in places like Yemen.
Do you want to start with that, the response, the final question about how to I mean, is there...
I think the major effort has been to drive the narrative of the humanitarian crisis right now. That's the efforts, at least, that I'm engaged in by a number of international NGOs and humanitarian actors, is to drive the narrative of the cost of this war, because it could be debatable where you stand on the spectrum, whether this was a justified intervention or not, whether the rebels are doing the right things or not. But that's not the issue. The issue is that we have around 20 million people who are at the edge of famine, if they haven't already fell to famine. So the narrative that is now being driven, and that's why we are seeing so much coverage in the past few days, it was all driven by this new campaign to bring back the issue of the humanitarian situation to the front. So, I mean, the Disaster Emergency Committee here in the UK had a big campaign in December and was able to raise around £17 million from the public to support humanitarian operations in Yemen. The other side of that is putting pressure on the major powers of the world to take a more active stand to resolve the war, rather than to stand as viewers or bystanders. Now, the big effort there has been to try and push the agenda of the arms sales, because that's the most painful agenda for the UK or for the US, that they are the biggest arms suppliers. They are making a lot of money out of the coalition. Of course, that's unjustifiably pressure on one side than the other, but the pressure is attempting to push these major powers to play an active role in ending the war. So there is a judicial review that started this week on the UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and you might have seen some of that coverage in the different media outlets. But that's now the narrative that people are trying to push in order to bring the war to an end.
And do you, as far as the major powers are concerned, I mean, what do you think is the right route for them? They have taken, both in Syria and in Yemen, a position of being not neutral, but not involved. In other words, supplying weapons, having drones, blah, 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 but not actually getting seriously involved. Do you think that being neutral is a better position, or do you think being involved is a better position, talking of Yemen?
Yeah, and I think that's a good chance to also comment on when Syria became important. You mentioned that it became relevant when ISIS, but I think it became really an issue, and the focus became on Syria when the refugee crisis hit, because that's when people in Europe felt that it's now close to home. And that's what triggered the whole attention on Syria, was the first waves of the refugee crisis. But I think in a big way, the whole war on Yemen was a disappointment for many of the Yemeni, especially young people, because as we went through the whole wave of the Arab Spring and the optimism of joining a global order of human rights, of the right to have representation and the right to be protected and all that, the majority, I would say, of young people feel left out or feel let down by the international community, by the global order that they were starting to believe in, because they were left on their own to die either at the hands of militia groups that are taking control, or at the hands of the coalition bombing and airstrikes, with a blanket support from the major powers of the world. So I think we haven't seen any effort from the international side to bring this war to an end, a credible effort. And so, in my opinion, I think it's better if we had that active role and active enrollment in trying to bring a solution and bring an end to the war, rather than have a more passive-aggressive, I think, because passive while supplying arms is what we have right now.
Do you have a view on that?
I think for the narrative, what we need is to differentiate between the cause and the results. So the famine is a result. And no matter how much money you spend, no matter how much fund you get, if you don't stop the war, the famine will continue. So, and the cause, for example, like if you read the international news outlets or you watch them, you see that they define the problem in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is fighting inside against Yemen or in Yemen, but Saudi Arabia is a result. It's not a cause. The coup, which took over the state, is the result. So is the cause. So if the militia, the Houthi militias, with their allies, the forces of the President Ali Abdullah Saleh, if they stop the war, then Saudi Arabia would stop the war automatically. They are the key to the problem. So that when we address that cause, then people will start to fix the problem of and bring money to the country, help the hungry people, and we can focus on the other issues. But now any solution to any kind of problem in Yemen without solving the main key issue will be pointless. And then after stopping the war, I think we have for the intervention of the international community. For me, it's not a matter of choice. They have to. It's a must, and it's an obligation. There is something called Security Council, and the Security Council has put Yemen under the Chapter 7, which gives them the permission to intervene militarily. And the Chapter 7 does not only give the permission to start a war or to wage a war, but also it imposes the obligation to enforce peace. And to enforce peace, it means that the Security Council has to impose on the Houthi militias to apply the 2016 resolution, which asks them to hand over their weapons to the state. And then we can talk about the economic development, which the international society or the Western world or the UN or the organization, everyone can be part of and help Yemen. I mean, without really talking about the causes, any trials to solve the consequences or the results will be pointless.
Now, just finally, is there anyone here from either an Iranian or a Saudi or a Gulf point of view, perhaps, who wants to say something from the region or from the? We've been taking your country's names in vain. Anyone? No? No? Oh, well, you had your chance. Rafat, do you want to make a final statement, and I'll ask Safa?
Yeah, I think today there was an article in The Guardian, and in it was a quote from an old lady, Fatima, who is taking care of her grandchildren because everyone else died. And she said in the quote, which was the title of the article, that we either die from hunger or from bombs. We are dying from hunger or from bombs. I really doubt that people who are now having to make the choice, as we also read in a previous media piece, between which child to save because they cannot feed both children. I really doubt that they care about who is to blame or whether it was one side or the other and whether we should blame it on each side or what the cause is or anything. I think that for the majority of people who are today suffering and dying, they just want an end to this. They just want a solution, and they want the country to move on. And I think that's where the narrative should focus on, that we need an end to this war. We do not need to start again trying to identify who started or who to blame, because people are dying on the ground. I think that's where the focus should be.
Any final comments, Safa?
No matter how dark the picture, like in Yemen, looks, I really hope that things will get better. But I also know that things will not get better until we get the facts straight and we call things by their names, what the situation is and who the players are. And that's it.
Okay, thank you both very, very much. Thank you all for coming. Very, very helpful and very sobering topic. We are meeting again in 2 weeks' time on the 23rd of February as this What's in the News session to talk about Africa, about democracy in Africa. David Pilling, Africa editor of the Financial Times, will be coming to share his perspective on the progress of democracy in Africa as evidenced or as tested through the process in the Gambia recently. And I will announce the other panelists as soon as I've identified them or sorted them out. But thank you again very much for coming, and thank you both to Safa and to Rafat for taking part. Thank you.
Thanks.